Hello, my name is Nicholas Felton. Thanks so much for bringing me out here and for coming out to see me talk about some of my work. So what I'd like to share with you today is the process behind my latest annual report. I call this presentation too big to fail because this one nearly got the better of me, and I only released it last month. Typically these things take about 2 months, and this one had gotten so large and so massive that it took 8 months to build. So this is the project I've been working on and off for 10 years. It's the Feltron annual report. Here you can see some of the printed versions of this project. And I've conceived of this project as a continuum, 10 different annual reports from 2005 to 2014. As you can see, I've now completed 9 of these 10 reports, so I have 1 left to do. I'm recording information for that as we speak, and that should be out next year, and then hopefully I'll make a book, put all these together, and figure out something new to do with my career. So, over the course of this project, I've looked at almost every aspect of my behavior that I can imagine. This has included, the activities, the things that I do, what I wear, the conversations I've had with people, what I drink, what I eat, where I go, media that I consume, like reading or watching or music, my mood, photography, social connections, the tools that I use, and the types of transportation that I use. So I think I've got this pretty complete look at the types of things that I do. And over the course of these 10 years, I've gotten better and better at analyzing these different pieces of my behavior with greater and greater resolution. So if you look at this graph, this is from the first annual report, which was done retroactively, meaning I didn't set out to record information for it. I merely took what I'd gathered over the natural course of the year and built this graph, which represents the relationship between work and play in my life. So these weeks with big red bars mean that I was mostly traveling or not working, whereas the big white bars are when I was spending most of my time working. So over the course of the year, these 52 weeks, I had this sort of course view of my life. And I think it tells an interesting story, but as you try and perfect a craft, you try and do things in more and more detail. So if you skip ahead now to the 2012 report, this is the kind of detail with which I can present a day in my life. This is an aggregate of 365 days. You can see these peaks and valleys that represent like sleep and my eating habits, my reading habits, when I happen to be in meetings or designing, and how this typically flows over the course of the day. Similarly, I can talk about this difference in the granularity of my location data. So in 2005, it was basically done looking at calendars or using my memory to talk about the states that I went to and the different countries, how many days I spent abroad, versus both 2010 and 2011, where I just kept track of every single place that I went, not just countries or cities, but like down to the bars or even the banks that I visited. So this map shows Manhattan over those 2 years with peaks for every single place that I went. And I was even interested in like what were the pros and cons of sharing this information, not just on a map where you can't tell what everything is, but in list form. So here you can actually read the names of every single place that I went. And is this going to compromise my privacy to share this with everyone, or am I all right with it? And what I learned was I was pretty much all right with it, except for 2 places that I didn't feel like I wanted to indelibly record in print for the rest of my life. So not bad out of, almost 1,000 places. So last year, I set out with this new thesis. Can communication be used as a test for how interesting something is? And I consider this to be sort of like the Twitter test, right? The big criticism against Twitter is, this is just people talking about their breakfast. But if you are talking about your breakfast, it has passed this communication threshold. It is something that you've decided is interesting enough to share with the rest of the world, and is probably going to be a break in your habits or something new or unusual that you're talking about. So every time that we choose to communicate something, we're passing this threshold in our brains, and we're saying this is worth communicating. And so rather than simply recording everything that I do, like every beer I drink or every egg I eat, maybe I should simply look at what I choose to communicate and use that as a filter prior to the editorial curation that happens later on in the design process. Communication is something I'd looked at a little bit before in my process. In 2006, I'd simply counted up text messages and emails because it was something that was available, and this was the beginning of the project, so I was just looking for numbers everywhere. I don't know if there's much context here to understand whether this is a big or a small number. I had similarly done an evaluation of SMS with a friend in around 2007 or 2008, where I started getting more into the content, looking at, I think I have a count of WTFs and OMGs here, so 7 and 9 of those, and how many exclamation points were used. And in 2009, this was a year where I asked people to tell me what we were talking about and what I did. Here you can see a little bit of an analysis of the content of things that were discussed, like movies that we talked about or the most discussed travel destination. And it's this great record of the time, and some of these conversations I can remember just by looking at the little list items there. So, as you can imagine, this is a bit of an audacious undertaking. And this image here is of the Tower of David. I think it's in Caracas, Venezuela. And it may be, or it was intended to be, the largest skyscraper in South America. So it was this ambitious undertaking. And unfortunately, I think due to finances, it was never finished, and it's now inhabited by squatters who have made it their own. They've taken over the floors, and they built houses and apartments in it, and they've strung it up with electricity and like rudimentary plumbing. And so even though it's unfinished, there is a value in it. And this is kind of my idea for trying to record all my communication. It's a very hard undertaking, but I felt that even if it wasn't 100% successful, there would be a ton of value in trying to do this. So it's high risk and high reward. I chose to lay out some of the development time involved in doing this project over the 9 years I've undertaken it. So you can see in for 2005, it was the course of the year to record the information, and then a very short sliver in 2006 to design the report. And this sliver's been getting fatter and fatter and fatter every year until down in 2014, you can see we're about 200 days into the year before the report was launched. This is one of the reasons this project's going to have to end after 10 years, because this pattern is just unsustainable, and it's going to start wrapping into New Year's eventually. So in terms of my approach, how do you capture communication? This was the big challenge, and I always enjoy coming up with these methodologies for trying to capture novel aspects of my behavior, things that aren't necessarily gatherable by everyone. And I saw the problem in these terms, this break between metadata and data, between structured content and unstructured. So if you think about email, you have these structured pieces of it, like the time and day when it was sent, the addressee, the IP address it was sent from. That's all structured. These have to be unique, identifiable things in order for email to work. And then you have the content of it, or the data. And this is the unstructured, wild area where you can type whatever you want, or use emojis, or put in GIFs, right? This is the harder part for you to analyze in any sort of repeatable way. So for each of the communication dimensions that I wanted to capture, I had to get both the metadata and the data for it. And a lot of the stuff you just get for free as a course of using these products, like email or SMS or Facebook chat or Twitter. All these things are just being archived. This can be seen as an advantage or a disadvantage of these products, that you are leaving this huge digital trail. But for the purposes of this project of wanting to have access to a year of this data, it was really an asset for me. So this is great. This stuff is just going to take care of itself, and I wouldn't have to do anything over the course of the year besides using email, SMS, and Facebook chat as I normally would. This becomes a little more difficult in using some of the other digital tools that we rely on so much for communication, like telephone, FaceTime, or Skype. So there's metadata being recorded here. You can go back and get the logs of who you were talking to, what time it was, how long it was, even how many megabytes of data were transferred. But the content of it is not going to gather itself. So this was a place where I would have to write down a synopsis of what occurred afterwards. This was a dimension that I tried to capture, but actually proved to be just too ephemeral and too far-reaching to get at, but I think is an important aspect of communication, which is all the little likes and comments that we leave in social networks all over the place. You know, these are social signals between ourselves, the public, our friends, and really does leave a trail of connections that is fascinating, but as you can see in this list here, it starts with a strong list of candidates, and then for me, it just goes into this long tail that would have been too impossible to gather with completeness. Mail, postcards, packages, all these things I felt were an important aspect of my communication, and for this, the metadata wasn't even being collected. So every time I received something in the mail, I would have to type that up in a spreadsheet and then also do a little bit of a description of what it was that I'd received. And finally, this was sort of the holy grail for me, is conversation and nonverbal communication. These were some of the real pressing questions of like, who do I talk to and how many people and what is the content of my conversation? So for this, I would have to come up with a methodology for gathering both the metadata and the data of this really ephemeral aspect of our communication, and probably the most important and certainly the most personal dimension of communication. And, you know, I need a reason to do this. I'm not just going to do this for my health. I have to have curiosity. I have to have something that's driving me to want to get to the bottom of these questions. So these were some of the ones that I found really, really pressing and important questions that I would be able to answer for myself that almost no one in the world would be able to know the answer to. A couple of them that I thought were really, really fascinating are this idea of the difference between, you know, who we talk to and who we talk about, or the places that I go and the places that I talk about. Do these things match up, or is there a real distinction there? And what are the holes in the things that I talk about? An example would be like, I might talk about Kanye West a lot, but I don't talk to Kanye West. So you get this, you know, this big disconnect there in communication that I thought was really interesting. And simply some of the like, I guess it's about identifying my biases. Is the world as I really perceive it, or, you know, do I talk to 90% men and only 10% women, or the reverse, or is it even? I was also interested in answering this question, like, there's this sensation you feel when you talk to someone and you realize you haven't opened your mouth in like, well, I don't know how long, but the words sort of don't come out as smoothly as they do when you're in the midst of talking to a lot of people. So I was wondering if there was a way of defining how long that period of time might be, like what was the longest stretch between actually talking to someone, and you know, there may be a good German word for this name, but there isn't one in English. I also found the work of, what's his name, Renato Umali, while I was working on this project. And he's been doing sort of similar work in life logging and presenting the accomplishments of his year to his friends, but he frames it as an award show, which I really like. So these are like the awards for cats petted over the course of the year. And he has his friends get on stage, and there's probably a drum roll involved, like the winner of best eggs is scrambled. And he did a project that he called Days in Which I Talk to You. And so he'd been interested in answering this question, like, who are the people that I talk to the most? How many people do I talk to? And he'd come up with a system of rules for trying to answer these questions. So this was something I looked at when I was starting to pose the rules of how I would approach this question. He wasn't trying to do it as thoroughly, like he wasn't trying to put his life on hold to actually answer these questions. So you would be able to only achieve a maximum score of a 1 for days in which you talk to Renato Amali. If you talk to him on 2 different occasions or 2 different mediums, it would only ever be a 1. He answered the question of how do you record strangers by giving them sort of general classifications like waitstaff cashier or stranger on the street, which I thought was useful. And it's something about talking in chat rooms there. I chose to look for an iPhone app that would let me capture my communication. You know, this is the tool that I always have on hand, and it's going to do a decent job of capturing some of the metadata, like where am I in terms of latitude and longitude, and what's the time. But then this tool that I found called Fulcrum allows me to also add into it a custom questionnaire. So this survey could have conditional stuff in it, and I spent about a month starting in December of 2012 refining this questionnaire so that I could both build the habit in myself of recording my conversations and refine it to the point where I could move through it really, really quickly. So when I started out, I was interested in a couple things that didn't make it through to the end of the project, like what was the directionality of my communication with someone? Did I wave to someone and they didn't see it or ignored me? I thought that would be interesting to know. Who initiated the conversation I thought was interesting. But these are things that kind of fell by the wayside, and I realized they were just going to take too much time over the course of the year to actually prove their worth. So this is the final production survey that I used for all of 2013. You can see all the different options here. This is almost like a taxonomy of the way in which I tend to greet people, so or the types of conversations I have. Let's see, you can see the greetings here. These are the greetings that I'm most likely to use with people. Good morning, what's up, dude, hey, hi, hello, how are you, nice to meet you, bye, goodbye, good night, take care, see you later, or other where you can add in something. In addition, I have the pleasantries, and then I would write a little synopsis of the conversation afterwards and talk about where it was and how long it took. So here's a sample one. This is with my girlfriend over lunch in our home, and we talked about her rehearsal schedule, the delicious flat white whole wheat everything bagel with white fish and avocado that she had for lunch, Dropbox's camera roll backup, and the definition of the word scrappy. And that took 38 minutes, I believe. So with this, I'm trying to wrestle with this question of fidelity. You know, for most annual reports, if I felt like there was a problem with the data, then I probably wouldn't include it. So if it was compromised too much, then I don't have confidence in it. It's not answering the question, and therefore I probably shouldn't include it. With this, I can't be at that level. I'm not going to do audio recordings of everything. I'm just going to be recording a synopsis from my memory. And so I have to be okay with this much cruder degree of accuracy, which I thought, if I can even get 10%, this is going to be by far the best record that I could hope to get, and should be an amazing resource. So hoping for like 90% of the metadata and then about 10% of the content. And I try to set up these projects to encourage better behavior in myself. So this might mean like going to new places, meeting new people, taking more of a close look at my health habits. And I was hoping that in setting up this conversation project, I would be able to improve a couple of things that, I think we all probably want to get better at, like remembering people's names, remembering conversations. And in that regard, I think the project was successful. I liked being able to, recall a bartender's name like 2 days later or the next time I saw them randomly. It was a good feeling to be able to do that. But there were a lot of unintended consequences to setting up this system. One was that this sort of Pavlovian conditioning of waiting for a greeting or a wave or something would be triggered when watching a movie or television. So I hear someone say, "Hello," in TV, and I would reach for my phone and think, all right, it's time to record this. And it even went on for a couple of weeks after 2013 ended. It made me really fearful of mail because, mail is typically not something you want to deal with. It's filled with bills and, statements that you don't want to look at. And then if you have to open up a spreadsheet and actually record where it was sent from and who sent it and what the content is, it just piles up to an even greater degree than it used to. I have to confess that there were times in which I avoided talking to people because I was just tired and I didn't want to record a conversation. So, someone might hold the door for me and I'd just be like, I'm not going to say thank you. I'd just walk through it. So it may be a little bit ruder. That was unintended. There's a huge time commitment. Sometimes, I could get by with just recording this stuff and it would take, maybe 10 or 20 minutes over the course of the day, but at like a wedding or a conference like this, it's really fluid and I'm talking to, 10, 20, 30 people all day long. It could be an hour or two of work at the end of the day to record everything. And I think it may be dumber. So just having this process running all the time of like, I'm starting a conversation and I need to remember key points and trying to remember people's names. I think this extra thread probably made last year less productive, and I was probably a bit more stupid. And this has been proven out. There's a picture of these sugarcane farmers here because there was a study that was done looking at their IQ over the course of the year. And one of the things about sugarcane farmers is that they only have one harvest a year, and so their finances are entirely dependent on that paycheck once they've cut their crop and taken it to market. And as the financial pressure increases over the course of the year, approaching their harvest, on IQ tests they do worse and worse and worse until the harvest, and then they do better. So I think I was probably in their camp with that same sort of overarching pressure and extra thing that was on my mind all year. But it was a success. I carried it through. It was not without a lot of calculating, like how much longer do I have to do this for? 8 more months, 4 more months, 2 more months. But as you can see, I recorded almost 10,000 conversations, thousands of other messages and SMS, and as few phone calls as possible. And it got me to this awesome point. So once everything was cleaned up and put in a database, I use MySQL and I query it from processing, but I can make these awesome queries. So this short little line shows me all the people that I high-fived in 2013. We've got my girlfriend, we've got Stephanie Pozovec, who found out I was recording high fives and therefore tried to game the system and got to second place. My cat, who my girlfriend taught to give high fives, is there at number 3, and then my other friend Russ and some other people. I can find out who I had breakfast with as well. I think this is pretty fascinating data. But it was tainted a little bit during the course of the project by the Snowden revelations. So, while I was trying to monitor myself and set up this massive surveillance project on myself, he was revealing the fact that the government had been doing the exact same thing, not just in the US, but sort of globally. So it gave me course to think about, what am I doing? They're making these reports as well. And all the stuff that I was interested in was like a shopping list for the government as well. They have all these inroads into all my stuff. It's extremely frustrating because I'm doing all this work and they're actually doing the same thing for me. So it would be much more helpful if I could just use their data. And I put a question mark on conversation because there are even articles during the revelations about how the NSA has figured out, how to get your iPhone or your Android phone to just, act like a microphone and record conversations even if you think it's off. So they may have everything. There's a mail program in the United States where if you use the postal service, they record the origin and destination of every piece of mail. They probably know what's in it as well, so I could have scrapped my whole spreadsheet and just asked them for it. And there were these tweets last year as well when these revelations came out. This one says, "The only gripe I have with the NSA collecting is that they don't make one of these for me every year," and they link to my website. Or Wet Web Work said, "If the NSA were a two-person startup and gave you access to all your data Feltron style, we'd say, take my money." So, I knew that I was in an interesting position because I had all this data, and I was probably interested in some of the same questions that the NSA was interested in, but I also was in a position to show the rest of the world what was knowable from this set of data. Like, what are the things that you can extract once you have access to all the communication data? So, I didn't really like what the NSA was doing with their data viz, so I decided that, I would take my own crack at it. And especially a quote like this really pushed me to feel a bit more responsibility towards doing something meaningful with this data. If the government's saying that, don't worry, we only kill people based on metadata, it's not really satisfying or doesn't put me at ease because, that is the nugget of it. And the more I worked with it, the more valuable I found the metadata was. The content is almost a distraction sometimes from the actual true understanding of what's being passed around. So, at the end of the year, I've got Snowden on one shoulder, I've got this giant set of data that I have to make sense of, and almost 100,000 records to go through. So typically, when I've done an annual report, I've relied just on a spreadsheet and going through it by hand and trying to clean it. And this has given me this great sense of completeness and knowing that I'm really familiar with the data set, I know what's in it, I've found all the good stories. But this one was just way too large to be able to do this by hand. So I had to rely on a bunch of automation processes. So making scripts using processing, using an API called Alchemy that does text analysis, the Google Maps API for geocoding things, and NLTK, which is the Natural Language Toolkit, which is another sort of natural text analysis program. Here's the month of progress to clean up all my conversation data. So there were a couple shortcuts I took over the course of the year, like grouping people together, and I had to expand everything so that I could query it in a clean way. And once I'd done that, I was able to pass some of this text into these tools, like the Alchemy API. This is a web service, and if you send it a paragraph, it will start identifying keywords in it or entities. And here you can see how it's identified a couple of different countries and people and cities in a block of text that I've given it. So I just passed everything through there, and I relied on it categorizing my this unstructured set of my communication to try and bring it into a structured world where I could start combining things, counting and aggregating and classifying them to gain this sort of bird's eye view of what's going on in my communication data. NLTK was amazing as well. So if I passed through all my conversation data, I got this list of what it calls bigrams or co-locations. These are two words that sit next to each other frequently or in a statistically significant manner. And what was amazing is this is a pretty good synopsis of my year just from looking at the communication data. And I see things like Hurricane Sandy, the annual report, Mill Valley, my hometown, Reporter app, which I released last year. All these things that it can just pull out based on a couple of algorithms that are in the software. So, as you know, I eventually released the report. And what was interesting about this year is that I didn't find doing one report to be a satisfying presentation of this data. So there's actually multiple reports in my conception of the outcome for this project. There's the design for everyone. This is the printed annual report that's being produced right now. This is the one that you can view on my website or purchase a printed copy. This is where the typical concerns come in of a graphic designer of trying to find the right typeface to use. These are some of the ones that I looked at. I was in this mindset of what is the typeface of choice for Big Brother? How does Big Brother typeset a report about the communication of its citizens? They probably don't have delicate typography. They're probably something more like what it goes on in a terminal, a monospace piece of typography. But I also want to be able to use it in some of the forms that I have an affinity for, where I can get some typographic texture out of it. So I looked at all these options. Some of them worked for headlines, or others worked for body copy, but none of them was really satisfying. And fortunately, Font Bureau released this typeface about 2 weeks before I was done with the project, Input Mono. This is primarily designed for use in your text editor, for coding or on screen, but it's got all these beautiful extra weights. So these are proportionally spaced rather than the monospaced one. It comes with compressed and condensed weights that are not that useful at small sizes, but made beautiful headlines for me. There's even a serif version. It's actually a free download, so if you have any interest, you can go to Font Bureau and get this typeface. But it was a lifesaver for me, and it fit in with this aesthetic that I was pursuing. I think the graphics from the movie War Games that was released when I was a kid were especially inspiring for this vision of what the government might, how they might represent my data. And so the data set is filled with all these delicate elements. So curating a version for everyone is kind of a difficult process. How do I tell a lot about my life while respecting NDAs and secrets and confidences that are a part of this data set? When I started, I was choosing to go medium by medium, so looking at SMS or my email and representing both the metadata side and the content side of these different cuts on my data. And I thought this was interesting. This is how SMS would look. There's like a heat map of the records over time. There's this proportionality rendering of sent versus received messages to different people. And then on the content side, there's like a tree map of the categories of data alongside this idea of mapping the places that were discussed. So on the left side, you'd see the metadata. On the right side, you'd see the content. And this was interesting initially, but I just felt like it was going to get really monotonous to do this for 6 different spreads, and whether they would look different enough to be satisfying. This is the structure, as you can see. It would just be the same one over and over and over. And it was interesting because it allowed me to dive deep on certain topics. Like, unfortunately, this one doesn't appear in the final report. This is looking at different lengths of expression of ha in SMS. So calculating, I'm typically a ha-ha or a H with 3 A's kind of guy. But there were some instances of very long ha-ha-has. So I had to scrap that stuff. And what I wound up doing was sort of extending this idea of comparing metadata to data, but drawing out that structure over the entire report. So starting at the most removed look at the entire set of data. So this would be just like the volume of communication over time. And then peeling back a layer and looking at volume of different types of communication over time and how that changes, and like what were the longest gaps for this medium, or what was the day in which I communicated the most in this medium. And then digging a little deeper into the metadata, like who were the people that I talked with. And then going into content, so what's the vocabulary? What are the words that are being used? And crossing this threshold into the content. Now I'm looking at the content of location, so the places that I'm talking about in comparison with the places where I'm having these conversations, the topics, and then finally into what I think is the most personal piece of this data set, which is like nonverbal encounters, the greetings that I had, the pleasantries that I used. So these are one-on-one And this is the sort of the end of this tale of the journey from metadata through to content. And I think you can see, if you look through the document, the vulnerabilities that arise at all different pieces of this. And it's not just limited to the content. So, I think our initial response to hearing that someone's reading our email is like, oh, they're reading the content, but that's not actually the whole story. Like, just seeing who emails you or when emails happen can be just as intimate as the content itself. So this is the report that I released, I think August 19th it came out, so it's about a month old now. These are some of the spreads, and I'll take you through a couple of these pages. This is a piece that inspired the cover. This is a shot from the Hubble telescope where it focuses on a really dark piece of sky, and this is the picture that emerges of thousands of galaxies that look like they're occupying a blank piece of sky. And so that sort of massive nature of this data set inspired this sketch that I built in Processing. So Processing, if you don't know, it's a Java application that's built for designers to try and get you to use code to make really visual things. And I love it because it will output PDFs. And so I use it to interrogate my data. And here you can see each of these, I'll replay this, each of these dots in this sketch represents one entity with which I had communication. I kind of have this exposure control where I can bring them out of the darkness by changing the scaling factor. And then for the largest ones, I can convert those to crosses. And so these are the meaningful ones that I'm going to label on the cover. And I think there's about 5,000 different entities that I communicated with here. This is the cover and how it'll be printed. So some of the graphs inside, this is like the rundown of the different mediums and their counts. This is a look at this is like an initial test rendering just to lay out some of the data and start to look for patterns. This one I found really interesting. This is my email over the course of the year. It's midnight to midnight, left to right, and January 1st to December 31st, top to bottom. And there are these, I think, everyone could do this for their own email and start to see things that they recognize here. For me, I can see this horizontal band where I released the last annual reports. That's all the email associated with that. I see this vertical line that's the billing report for my website Datum that comes in every day and shifts when it's daylight savings time. And then at the bottom is where I announced Reporter app, which was another app I was building. And so you can see this batch of static there. I think the same holds true for SMS, where there are these really intimate aspects of simply looking at the time of day when activity happens. So here I can identify, both my sleeping patterns. I can identify when I'm traveling by shifts in the time zones, and even these blank gaps here, I think, indicate when I'm traveling with my girlfriend. So most of my communications with her, and so if I'm not SMSing, that probably means I'm with her. So you can extract sleep, time zone that you're in, even like traveling and social context just from looking at the time of day when I'm SMSing. So this is the first page, looking at the metadata of the entire set, total records. Some of the graphs that I use throughout use this sort of stippling approach, but I found that interesting for talking about things like email over time or Facebook messages over the course of the day. Again, here you can start to identify like sleep patterns, how I tend to go to bed after midnight in there. And I was trying to identify ways of extracting meaning, sort of personal processes that could come out of this. So one I found was that by looking at people who cross over multiple mediums was a really good way of looking for the people who are closest to me. So if I spoke to you in all 6 mediums, you were probably my girlfriend. If I spoke to you in 5 mediums, you were close friends, and the sort of tail drops off from there. And this is the list. And if I cut this again for the number of messages, I could probably identify my closest core friends from this list. This was a look at networks of people based on some of the work that I did last year on building a physics model for my social network. And here you can see how each one of these particles represents a person that I communicated with, while these different magenta squares are different mediums. And so this little sketch that I set up causes these particles to want to migrate to the medium that they had the most affinity for. So there's a big cluster around email. These are the people that I only spoke to in email. There's another big cluster that's only conversation, the people that I only talk to face-to-face. And then as you float towards the middle, this means that you were someone that I was talking to in several different mediums. And you can see this line that moves here from sort of top right to middle left. These are people who are caught between Facebook messaging and in-person conversations, which kind of lines up with people that were my coworkers at Facebook. Looking at words recorded, narrowing that down to unique words, and then starting to look at vocabulary, like how do the words that I use, that I send, relate to the words that I receive. And there's a big cut there between the salesy speak that we tend to receive versus the more personal, descriptive words that I use to talk about myself. This is the map that I was talking about of places that I talk about. And here you can see some of the biases of the algorithms. I got to speed up. All right. The funny thing here is that, these algorithms are building on each other. So if one identifies a place like Modern Living as a place, and you send that to Google, Google then goes, oh yeah, I know where that is. That's in China. And so it puts it on a map. This is a graph of the stuff from NLTK. And finally, the interpersonal stuff, like greetings and pleasantries and nonverbal communication that I used. So finally, a couple of the other iterations that are much faster. The design for me, which is simply this book that contains all my communication, and this was built in this big process of having the conversation, going into the app, going into a spreadsheet, MySQL, the database, parsing it and processing to an XML file, which I imported to InDesign, and then output to Blurb, who printed this book for me. So this is just a quick flip through it, showing every single conversation that happened in 2013. Thank you. And this is some of the detail. So this was in China, so these people will never know about this, but they're not going to complain. And so, this is an amazing thing, but it's filled with all these secrets and stuff that I don't want other people to read. So the idea here is could I make different slices of it that are specific to a certain person, or could I, have it exist in a gallery or somewhere with seals on it, or redact the different pieces of it so that other people could look at it. And then for the participants themselves, I have this idea of a sort of Freedom of Information Act where if you are represented in this data set, you should be able to get out the information that speaks to you. So for each of these participants, they should be able to get a little book or a PDF of everything and some of the visualizations that go along with it, a little book that has their conversations. And because they're not here and they're generic people, I can show you this is the map of baristas that I talk to, and this is what I talk to baristas about, or what I talk to waitresses about. So my final discoveries, this is sort of personal data at a big data level for me. There are all these truths and sensitivities in metadata, but there are also lies buried in it that should be concerning. These are records that my metadata says happened in Burma last year, which I never went to. So, I hope that does not affect my standing with the government. And, this desire for privacy is something we built into Reporter, where we have no servers. So if you use this app, it's entirely private. And finally, if you want a copy of the printed report, it's at Feltron. Some of the processing apps are going up on my GitHub page, so you can visit that. And thank you for bringing me out. Cheers.